Hi, and welcome to Introduction to 2D Design. In this lecture, I'm going to start off by telling you a bit about the class, and then we'll get right into the first lesson. Afterwards, I'll do a demonstration where I show you how to use all the tools that we have procured for you in this class. Each of you will get a packet of tools to work with. And then I'm going to get into a demonstration of how to do the homework that you're assigned. All right. So first, I am your professor, Sarah Jacobs, and I'll show you a little bit about the type of work that I make on my own in my studio. So I'm an art professor, of course, but I'm also a fine artist, and I've been doing portraiture lately, and as well as these kind of pieces at the bottom that incorporate plants and patterns. So you'll see that my work often incorporates something living with patterns, and patterns often reflect the motif of the subject. You will have the opportunity in this class to attend extra credit events. Anytime you attend an artist lecture that's about an hour long, and these could be virtual Zoom artist lectures or in-person artist lectures, you can get 1 extra credit point on your very final grade. So it's actually a kind of a big deal because it could take you from an 89 to a 90, for example. And if you do a few of these, you can get more points. And so I will sometimes tell you about ones that are coming up that you can attend, or you can go off and find them on your own, as long as you get them approved by me first. Just send me a link to the event and say, would this count towards an extra credit? And when you're there, either virtually or in person, just take a selfie so I can see that you were really there. You can turn that in for the extra credit point. The ones that are up here are just examples of some artist lectures that have happened in the past, not necessarily ones that are happening right now. Okay. So in this class, we're going to cover 2 different kinds of issues in regards to art. First, we'll talk about things that make up artwork, like shape, space, colors. And in the second half of the class, after midterms, we're really going to focus on how to use those elements to create composition. So composition refers to the way that everything is arranged within a picture plane, within the artwork, the 2-dimensional artwork. And so that will make a lot more sense as the class goes on. You understand what these terms mean. We're going to cover line and shape, motion, space, color in terms of its mood aspects, its ability to influence the mood of the person seeing the color, as well as the components, the technical components of color, hue, value, and saturation. And then we're going to get into composition theory with unity and harmony, how to make a piece look cohesive, an artwork look cohesive, how to balance asymmetry, how to establish a focal point, and how to create a rhythm in your artwork, and how that rhythm will also help affect the mood. Color and rhythm are 2 of the main things that affect mood in artwork and how it's read. We'll also talk about scale and texture in this class. Now, in the lectures that I will be giving in these videos before my demonstrations of how to go about starting your homework, I'm sorry, I blanked there for a second. In these lectures, I'll start off by giving a lecture, and then I'll do a demonstration. But in the lecture, I will cover some aspects of whatever concept we're going through that might not necessarily relate to the homework itself, but relates to the overall topic that we are covering that week. And it's important for you to pay attention to every aspect of the lecture and learn all the vocabulary and terminology, even if it doesn't apply to that particular homework assignment, because at the very end of the semester, you're going to have a final project that will require you to know all of that terminology. And here's the final project. So I ask you to please pause this video and read it. I'm not going to read it out loud to you, so just pause me now, please. Okay, now that you're back, I think you can see why you would need to know all the vocabulary that I described, because when you deconstruct the 2 artworks that you're going to use to establish the new artwork that you're going to make, you're going to have to give a lecture where you describe the 2 artworks, kind of break them down. And so anything that we cover in this lecture might apply to the artworks. It all depends on what artworks you choose, but any of these lessons could potentially come into play, that vocabulary and that kind of understanding of what it means and how it's applied to artwork will be important. And we will talk a lot more about this final project in the last few weeks of the semester, so you don't have to keep this in mind right now. I just want you to know why it's so important to pay attention to all the vocabulary that we cover in these lectures. So for this class, you have a syllabus, and inside the syllabus, it has a weekly and daily breakdown of what we do every single day. And so there's never any reason to say, hey, I didn't know, what we were doing that day. It also has all the due dates, and it has all of the assignments listed in there. So no need to email me, just look at your syllabus and you'll find almost everything you need. And if there's something that's missing, certainly email me. Celtic Online has your grades, your syllabus, and it has these videos. So it'll be your go-to source. And you'll also be posting some of your homework to the updates page on Celtic Online as well. This is a sentence that you might have heard before in regards to architecture. It's something that I want you to keep in mind in this class for all kinds of design. It means that, so the word function, of course, is what the thing does or what the thing says, right? It's the action, right? It's the outcome. And form refers to all the decisions that are put into creating the thing that has the output. So let's say I was designing a logo for a company. The form would be decisions like, what color do I use? What kind of shape do I want to put in this? What kind of angles do I want to put in this? Do I want it to have a certain kind of vibe? Do I want it to be soft looking? Do I want it to be hard looking? All those kind of decisions are called formal decisions, and they should all be in the service of what the logo is meant to do. So if the logo is advertising a company that creates, let's say, something really frightening, like let's say that they create handguns or something like that, you wouldn't want to have kind of curvilinear shapes and have it kind of pastel colors. That just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't serve the function. Whereas if you are designing fancy, elegant stemware, wine glasses, things like that, it might make sense to have kind of curvilinear shapes and maybe some softer colors, or colors that relate to wine, like burgundy or like yellows, things like that. So all the choices that you make in creating an artwork or a design affect the way people read it. That's what form follows function means, and I will say this over and over again in this class. So what is design anyway? Design is anything that we create in order to look a certain way and portray a certain thing to the world. Okay, so if you think about logos, obviously that is design. If you think about a fine artwork of painting or something, obviously that is design. But think about things that are more ephemeral. Like, for example, if you've ever watched a makeup tutorial on YouTube and they're teaching you how to make a certain kind of look, with the makeup, that's design. The way that you arrange the furniture in your house, design. The way that you arrange flowers in a vase, that's design. It's any time that you intentionally make things look a certain way in order to, be seen by the outside world. What is 2D design? 2D design is just anything that's design-oriented and flat. So it wouldn't be sculpture. Sculpture is design, but sculpture is not 2D design, it's 3D design. So if I was going to design a hairbrush, that's not 2D design, that would be 3D design, but both are design. So we're going to get into our first lesson today, which relates to line and shape. Okay, so pictograms are the basic images as symbols. And so you see these on bathroom door stalls, you see these in parks telling you where you can go to play basketball, where you can go for walking trails, that kind of thing. You see them everywhere, really. You see them alongside the highway. And I saw a TED Talk a while ago where a person who was a consultant about language, who was an expert in communication, was on a road trip with one of her friends, and she kept seeing a certain symbol along the side of the road. And she said to her friend, "Why are we passing so many Chinese symbols in the middle of the Midwestern United States. And her friend said, you know, what the hell are you even talking about? And then they passed the symbol again, and she pointed it out to her friend. And her friend just laughed because this is what they saw, which is, of course, is a symbol for a picnic table. But it looks like it might be the character from a foreign alphabet, I guess, as well, but because it's shown from the end. And so perhaps showing a picnic table from the end is an odd way to do so, because it's not like when we're using a picnic table, we go to the side of the picnic table, crouch down and look at it from that angle. But on the other hand, how would you design a picnic table that really looks like a picnic table? I mean, if you have it from looking at it from the side, it would just look like a table. You know, it wouldn't look like any particular kind of table. And so it is very complicated for designers to make even these simple shapes very clear, right? And pictograms have been used for since about 3000 before Common Era. So these have been used for ages, and it's still something that is really complicated for designers to create. So look at these, for example. Some of them are really obvious what they mean. You can see like the unisex bathroom in the upper left, and then female bathroom, male bathroom, elevator. But then what's the next one? It looks like a man running from fire, or a wave, or a bear's claw. I mean, it's hard to tell what that one is. And then the next row, I think it's a chef's hat, but what does a chef's hat advertise? Does that mean there's a restaurant nearby, or does that mean you're supposed to cook? I don't know. And then the next few are pretty obvious. The one on the far right, I guess it's a forest, maybe trees, but like trees aren't circular on top, so it kind of looks like lollipops. Bottom row, the table, I think that's pretty clear. Maybe it's a restaurant, but maybe the next one is the restaurant. You know, which of these is meant to signify restaurant, and which of them is meant to signify something else? Maybe ice cream. But when you get to the far right, it took me forever to figure out what that one meant. It looks like it's ping pong, perhaps, you know. But at first I thought, is that a bird sticking its head out of a top hat? So, this is the kind of challenge that designers have in trying to communicate while keeping it simple. So even photographs, though, are not perfect representations of real things. And so this is a photograph from when I was a kid of one of my little baby cousins, and he saw this photograph of himself, and he was about almost 2, and he just broke out in tears. And my aunt said, "What is wrong? You know, this is don't you recognize who this is?" And he said, "That little boy has my hat and my sunglasses and my cup," and he's just so jealous that this kid had his stuff, even though of course it was a photograph of him. But as a 2-year-old, you haven't yet realized that you could be represented 2-dimensionally and tiny. So of course he had seen images of people in photographs before, but he couldn't imagine himself 2-dimensional, and he couldn't imagine himself, you know, as big as the photograph was. And so no image, even one that is like photo perfect, as we say, is an actual kind of clear replica of a real thing. You know, all 2-dimensional things are only representations. Okay, so now that we have gotten through the introduction to the class and the basics of what design is and what design can accomplish and the limitations of design, we're going to get into the very first lesson, and that is going to be about line and then shape. So we're going to start with line. This is an image of the caves of Lascaux. The caves of Lascaux are in southwestern France, and they are 17,300 years old. And so ancient people began creating imagery out of lines before, you know, other types of artwork. People have lots of theories about what these could possibly be for. There are 2,000 images in this cave. People have thought that perhaps it was good luck for the hunting, or maybe it has served a religious purpose, or has something to do with astrology. I mean, there's lots of ideas, but there's absolutely no way to know what people were thinking that long ago. But we do find these sort of cave drawings formulated entirely, mostly by line, all over the world, not just in Europe. You find it in every continent. In the UK, you might have heard of the White Cliffs of Dover. They're white, these cliffs, because they are made of chalk. The land is made of chalk. And in many parts of the UK, there is chalk underneath the soil. So underneath the, the kind of soil that you can grow with the brown soil. And so if you dig far enough, you get to the chalk. And so ancient man created these geoglyphs by just digging away the topsoil to get down to the white clay underneath. And you find geoglyphs, which are drawings on the earth. You have to go way up in a plane to see them, all over the world too. We're going to talk about some geoglyphs in Peru as well. But let's talk about these first. You can see that ancient British people really liked horses, and in the bottom right, you can see something a little different. It's a man with a club and a gigantic erection, and that is called the Cerne Abbas giant, but in the UK, they refer to him as the rude man for obvious reasons. And he was actually made fairly recently in the year 1600 AD. All right, but some of the others are really quite old. The one on the upper left is in Oxfordshire, and it is called the, I have a note here, the Uffington White Horse, and it's from 1000 before Common Era. Quite old. And here you can see that when the Simpsons movie came out, some PR person thought it would be fun to have Homer next to the rude man. And so poor Homer was just made with non-toxic paint, and so he's gone. He's been gone for a decade at least. But the giant is still there. And if we go to southern Peru, you can find a different kind of geoglyph. This wasn't made by digging into the soil, but rather by laying stones. And so you have to wonder how ancient people were able to imagine what these things would have looked like from above, because obviously there was no air flight or helicopters back then, but they must have been trying to communicate something to someone or something. And so these were made by laying stones, and you can see in the upper left there's a tarantula. On the upper right, it seems to be a whale. Bottom right, we got a monkey with a really, really curly tail. And I'm not entirely sure what is on the left there, but these are also massive, just like the ones in England. And people have theorized that these might have been for walking. You walk on the stones in a path, possibly for some kind of religious reason. And these are made by the Nazca civilization, which were even older than the Incans. They predated the Incans in Peru. So we've seen that humanity started with outlines, but as each individual person in our art creation, we often start with outlines as well, starting our drawings with lines, because it is just the most immediate way to make a mark and to make an image. So what is a line? Mathematically, a line has absolutely no dimension at all. So you wouldn't even see this little black dot. There would just be nothingness. There's no height, no width, no depth to a point. But of course, that can't be true in art making. In art making, points are sort of blobs. They definitely have dimension. And of course, a line has only length and no other dimension in mass, and so you can't see it either. You can't see something that's one-dimensional. But in art making, of course, lines have thickness, they have quality, and the way that a line appears, the way that it looks, we refer to this as line quality. So this is a vocab word to keep in mind that you're going to use quite a bit. These are two different drawings that I've done in the past. The one on the left was made with ink, and it was a blind contour drawing, and you close your eyes and you try to remember people. So these are my grandparents. And then the one on the right is a pencil drawing, and you can see quite a big difference between the two and the quality of the lines. Line quality is decided by three things. One is the medium used. Is it pen? Is it paint? Is it pencil? How dark is the pencil? Is it colored pencil? Like whatever you're using to make the mark is called the medium. And that's one aspect that creates the line quality. The next would be the ground, which is the art term for a surface. It just means, like, what are you drawing on, or what are you painting on? What's the surface? And the third is the way that the person making the marks handles it. So the artist or the person writing or whatever, it's the handling. So remember that those are the three things that create line quality, and line quality just basically refers to how the line looks. So here is, I think this is Bega. This is a drawing where you can see lots of different line quality all throughout. Some lines are quite bold and thick. Some lines are really light, almost like look like they're partly erased. This is a abstract painting by Laura Owens, and here you can see all kinds of marks. Some really thin, some really fuzzy, and you notice that the fuzzy-looking ones look like they're further away, right? Because we think of things far away as not being as sharp as things close up. She has paint on there too, which is thick and actually three-dimensional, sticking off the surface. And so you see quite a bit of different line qualities happening there. Now let's talk about the fact that outlines are complete lies. So we start a drawing generally by creating an outline just to define where things are. But if you leave the image to be entirely made of outlines, it's not very representational of something that's realistic. So we use outlines because we intellectually know that they refer to the edges of things. So we can read this as a alligator or crocodile. I can never remember the difference. But we can read this as one of those. And it's because we have learned how to translate these lines into a three-dimensional idea. But if you look at me here in the corner of your screen, you can see that there are no lines around the edges of me. Rather, I just stop at a certain point, and then whatever is behind me starts. So here my hair just ends, and the leaves of this painting just start. There's no line anywhere. So what outlines actually do in images is to flatten the image. It makes it look like it has no volume. So this guy looks really quite flat compared to these by the same artist, Julian Opie. You can see that these have outlines, but they also start to have multiple gradients of light to dark. You know, there's a lightest part of the women's skin, there's the middle tone of the women's skin, and then the darkest quality of the women's skin. And that part looks really quite round, but you can imagine if the outline suddenly vanished, these would look so much more realistic than they do right now. This is another piece of vocab that I want you to keep in mind, the idea of implied line. And so sometimes there is no line, but our brains finish it for us. This is where optics and psychology meet. So look at the drawing of the woman in the bathing suit on the left. We can see that the bathing suit is white, the negative space around her is white, and so there's no line there. But we don't think that her body suddenly doesn't exist anymore. Our brains just kind of finish the line for us. Similarly, in the logo in the upper right, the H, we see it as an H. We don't see it as three shapes just because there is a white slash through it. We know that it's an H. Our brain can do that for us. And generally, when someone describes Pac-Man, I say, how would you describe Pac-Man? Just think about it for a second. Most people would say that Pac-Man is a circle with a wedge cut out. But Pac-Man is not a circle. A circle has only one line. It is part of a circle. It's a curve with two straight lines going towards the opposite side of the curve that meet at an intersection. It's not actually a circle, but we think of it as a circle because our brain finishes the circle for us, right? Line direction is also something very important to consider when you're crafting an artwork because it can affect the way that the viewer reads the work. We think of horizontal lines as relating to sleep. And so horizontal lines are seen as peaceful, they're seen as tranquil, they're seen as not particularly energetic or athletic. And in this piece by William Blake, you can see that he also used blue colors, which sort of give us this feeling of rest or maybe even slight sadness. Whereas vertical lines give an impression that something could happen. You know, it's like you think of a person standing or a person doing something when we see vertical lines. But the type of lines that most make the viewer feel like something dynamic is happening or some kind of movement is happening are diagonal lines. And why would that be? Think about it. The only time that we see a person in a diagonal, they are moving, because if they weren't moving, they would collapse. Right? Imagine you're taking a step and your leg comes out forward and you know, in a diagonal way to take the next step, and you just suddenly stop, you'd sort of fall over. You have to complete the movement in order to remain upright. And so diagonal lines very much suggest movement. And then think about other directions too. It's not like it has to be one of those three. There's also things like swirling lines. And so you can see in this Van Gogh, we get a real sense of movement and tumult. You know, the sky is, you know, the wind is blowing really quite intensely above this little town. And we only know that because of the direction of the night sky. And now into shape. I think we all have a sense in our mind about what shape is, but it's actually kind of hard to define if you think about it. So a shape is an enclosed area that is separate from its surroundings. It's another vocab to remember. And the picture plane and the ground of an artwork have their own shape. So that's the first thing to consider when designing an artwork. Is it going to be a rectangle? Is it going to be a square? Is it going to be vertical, which would suggest something like portraiture? Is it going to be horizontal, which might suggest something like a landscape, even if it's an abstract piece? You know, we even talk about portrait or landscape mode when we talk about photography. So there's a difference between the picture plane and the ground. More vocab to keep in mind. The ground, as we said earlier, is the surface. And so the ground here would be the canvases, and they have a certain shape. And the picture plane is the shape of the image. So often the shape of the image and the shape of the ground are the same. So that tends to be the case with oil paintings, for example, but it's not always the case. So if you look at these, what are the grounds and what are the picture planes for these two? Now you can pause me for a second to think about it. Okay, if you're back, the answer is that the paintings on the left of the horses, the paintings go all the way to the edges of the ground, which is the canvas that they're on, right? And so the ground and the picture plane are exactly the same. Whereas on the right side, the picture plane is the shape of the image, you'll recall, and it is different than the entire shape and size of the ground. The ground is a piece of paper that the image is printed on, and the image that is printed on it is the picture plane. So they're different there. Now let's talk about shapes that are within your picture plane when you're actually designing the image. There are a number of different types of shapes that we're going to go over, and the first are geometric. Geometric shapes are any shapes kind of defined by mathematical formulas. So circles, squares, perfect stars, diamonds, what are those other ones? You know, ones that look like this. It's been a long time since I took geometry in school, but anything that is made from a math formula. So there's another term, rectilinear shapes, and these all rectilinear shapes are geometric shapes, but rectilinear shapes also have a second level of definition in which they are made entirely out of straight lines. There's no curves within them. So if we look at the target symbol on the left, it is geometric, but it's not rectilinear. We look at the Adidas symbol on the right, it is rectilinear and geometric. Here's an example of rectilinear shape in artwork. And we also have organic shapes. Organic shapes are pretty much any shape that's not geometric. They tend to be found more in nature, which is why we call them organic shapes. There are two different types of organic shapes. One is curvilinear and the other biomorphic. Curvilinear shapes are made of S-curves, or we could think of the word arabesques, you know, very lovely, very smooth transitioning curves. Whereas biomorphic shapes are more blobby. They're less planned, you know. They kind of go any way they want to go. They're any kind of shape that is not geometric or curvilinear, and they have no rules. And so here in this Mucha poster from the Art Nouveau period, we see many, many, many curvilinear shapes in Sarah Bernhardt's hair, in oh, mostly just there. Yeah, I mean, we also have geometric shapes in the background, mostly the stars in the circle. But the hair here, very, very curvilinear. Just kind of lovely curves. Next, let's look at Salvador Dali, and here we see very biomorphic, blobby-looking shapes in art. So what kind of shapes do you see here? And there's going to be multiple types within each of these images. So please pause me and have a little look. All right, I'm back. Let's first talk about the Starbucks symbol. I think this is such a great symbol. In here, we see a star, which is a geometric shape. It's also rectilinear. We also see two circles, the circle of the picture plane and the circle that is made from the tails and the crown. You see the edges of the tails and the crown, and we see implied lines there because it's not actually a circle. It's a bunch of different shapes that just end at a certain point. But because of implied line, we can refer to that as a circle. We also see these lovely curvilinear arabesques in the mermaid's hair and her body, and a little bit in the stripes of the fins. Now, I love this I love this logo because it refers to water within the curvilinear, you know, liquid, and we think about this as a place that makes lots of different kinds of liquids, teas, coffees, all kinds of things. But I just think it's so nice that it starts with a circle because it reminds me of looking at a cup. Whenever you're at Starbucks, you're always looking at circles because you're looking at your cup. On the left, we can see lots of rectangles, which are of course rectilinear geometric shapes. We also see some biomorphic shapes, like in the black hair shape of this woman. And we see some curvilinear shapes in kind of the circles and the patterns on the side, and also the overall structure of the edge of her outfit against the wall behind it is very curvilinear. So why would you pick one type of shape over another when you're designing something? Logos, for example. I spoke already a little bit about why I think the shapes within the Starbucks mug are appropriate to that company. Now I want you to pause me for a second and think about why Adidas might have chosen these shapes for its logo. Okay, you're back now, hopefully. And I think that the rectilinear shapes make a lot of sense because Adidas is all about, like, you know, pushing through and being tough. You know, they wouldn't want to have any kind of biomorphic shapes that look lazy or look like they're languid. This makes a lot more sense. I also think that this looks a little bit like stairs. You know, you think about athletes running up stairs or trying to reach goals, trying to improve all the time. So we think about getting higher in your athletic practice, you know, going up steps. It also is nice that it looks like three pedestals in a way because it is almost like what happens at the Olympics, you know, silver, bronze, and gold, you know, standing together on pedestals. And it is at an angle. It is diagonal, which we know refers to movement, and, you know, the company is all about getting out there and exercising. So it's a perfect logo for what they do. Here are a couple of more vocab words I want you to know. Form is the apparent three-dimensionality of a shape that is actually two-dimensional. And so you see on the left, there's something that looks like a sphere and something that looks like a cone, but these are just drawings on flat paper. So we would say that these are forms. They are things that appear to be round, rendered to look so on a flat surface. And volume is the apparent three-dimensionality of that form. And so it's a little linguistic trickiness to get your head around. But if I said, make that form more voluminous, what I mean is make that thing that you've drawn on the two-dimensional surface look more three-dimensional, okay? And you can remember the volume for all those ads for shampoo where they say increases the volume, makes it look bigger, makes it look more three-dimensional. Other words to keep in mind for this class and our discussions and your final project are representational, stylized, and abstract. I find that people often mix up stylized and abstract, so let's define these. Representational refers to anything that is recognizable, anything that exists in the world, or even things that don't exist, like unicorns or goblins. But we know what it looks like because it's a part of our collective consciousness. And so anything that can be identified as what it is, as opposed to just being shapes. If it's just shapes and colors and it's not like nothing in the artwork is a thing or in the design is a thing, then we can say that it's abstract. So if you look at the piece on the bottom, the Kandinsky, that is completely abstract. It's made entirely of colors and shapes and textures. There's not a thing in there. On the upper left, we have a representational artwork, a monkey, landscape, candle, statue. On the right, we also have a representational image of a monkey, but this particular monkey is more stylized than the monkey on the left. The monkey on the left is also stylized because it is a painting. It's not a perfect representation, and we've talked about how perfect representations don't exist. So anything that is representational but not realistic is stylized. It's made to look like a cartoon, or it's made to look graphic. It's made to look something unlike how it looks in real life. And so I had said that the one on the left is also stylized, but to a lesser degree. And so this word stylized is relative, which is more stylized than the other. But this term only applies to representational imagery. So we wouldn't necessarily say that about the abstraction, because the abstract is already not a thing. It has its own vocabulary. So what I often find is that when people look at something that's graphic, or they look at something that's more of an illustration, they'll say that it is an abstracted, but what they really mean is that it's stylized because it's still representational. The two artworks that we see on the left have backgrounds. You can see there's a distinct difference between what's happening in the foreground and what's happening behind it. So let's look at the upper left. We have a monkey on a chair with a little statue and a table and a candle, and in the background we have the landscape. In the bottom left, this Poussin painting, we have the family in the foreground, and we have the architecture and the clouds in the background. On the right, there's a little bit of a different setup in this representational portrait in the upper right by Andrew Wyeth, and in the abstract painting in the bottom right by Kandinsky. There, people often say that the stuff behind the marks in the Kandinsky is the background, and that the black space behind the figure, the portrait figure, is the background, but really the correct term for this is negative space, because there's nothing there. When there's a background, there's stuff in it. there's clouds and mountains and whatever in it. But on the right side, if it's just completely nothing, or if there's nothing, like it's just sort of minor tones, then we would say negative space instead of background. Sometimes it's very unclear what is the positive shape and what is the negative space. And so I'm sure you have all seen these these images where if you look at on the left, if you look at the black sections, you see two faces looking at each other. And if you look at the white section, you see some kind of chalice. But it could be either one. So it just, when you see the faces, the chalice is the negative space. And when you see the chalice, the faces are the negative space. They're pretty much interchangeable. And sometimes that happens with other artworks as well. So look at the one on the right. Take, for instance, the gray shape in the upper right part of that painting. Is it behind the other shapes, or is it in front of the other shapes, cutting them off? It's impossible to know. It could be either one. You could see it either way. And so it's something fun that artists and designers sometimes play with in their work. I'd like you to pause me again as soon as I finish giving you directions here, and have a look at these logos. Most of them I think you will recognize. Some of them are British, so you might not recognize a couple of them. But try to think about a few different things that they have in common with each other. So you should pause me now. And you're back. So you may have identified more things than these, but the main ones that I want you to remember for your designs that we'll be working on are that logos tend to be compact. They don't seem to be much higher than they are wide, or much wider than they are high. Some of them are not completely the same, circles or squares. Like for instance, the Tommy Hilfiger in the bottom left is wider than it is high, but it's not way wider than it is high. And the reason that logos tend to be compact is that you could put them in lots of different places. They'll fit on a letterhead, they'll fit in the corner of a website, they'll fit anywhere because they're compact. You don't have to rearrange other designs wherever you're putting them to make them fit. Another thing we see here is that they are pretty simple in terms of the shapes, in terms of how much you got going on. They're not super complicated, and in terms of the colors. So look at the McDonald's, for instance. It's just two colors, very flat colors. They don't have a lot of highlights and shadows or embossing or anything like that. If you look at KFC, it's a little bit more of a complicated image, but it's still just red, white, and black. Okay, so simplicity helps it fit into more situations as it's placed, anywhere it might be found. But it also makes it easy to print, and it makes it very easy to recognize. So sometimes simplicity is the best for, catching people's attention and having them remember it for the next time they see it. And most importantly, these relate to the companies, like the shapes chosen, the colors chosen, they relate to what the company does. So if you look at the bottom row, you can see a panda, the World Wildlife Fund, and obviously pandas relate to their mission of saving endangered animals, but it's also just so cute. And so I'm sure they wanted to pick something cute for this logo because they want people to donate money, and people just say, oh, I gotta give money to the pandas. Whereas if they put something else on the endangered species on the list on their logo, like a bug or something, an insect, people probably wouldn't want to give them money as much. Look at the Nike swoosh. That is definitely, it looks like a check mark for one, which says like, check, I exercised today, I'm getting all the stuff done, I'm really efficient. But it's also looks like it's moving, not just because it's at a diagonal, but also because it tapers off. So it looks like it's moving really quite quickly. Let's look at one or two more here. The Pepsi. The colors are just very iconic, blue and red. They're primary colors, but we notice that it has a curvilinear line. Why might the shape be curvilinear for Pepsi? Because it's a liquid. It makes sense. And let's see, one more. Let's look at Safari. The Safari is on the right side. It is two above my head, and it looks like a compass. It's one of the more complicated ones because it has a gradient within the blue. I mean, that means the blue starts out light and then it kind of changes to dark and it gets light in other sections. But ultimately, it's still mostly just blue, red, and white. And it is a compass because compasses help you find your direction, and search engines also help you find your directions, and browsers help you get where you're trying to go digitally rather than, actually. But it makes a lot of sense. Now, typefaces people often refer to as fonts. Fonts are really, the term font actually relates to size. Typeface relates to the design of so when you say font, you usually mean typeface. Here you can see the typeface that I used for the category for the slide. The typeface that says the word typeface looks significantly more contemporary than the others. We know that the others look like they were designed a long time ago. They look old-timey, right? And we know this because they are much more kind of frou-frou. You've got a lot more flourishes to them. And when we refer to these flourishes in typeface design, we call them serifs. You've probably seen the words sans serif and serif when choosing a typeface in Word. If you look at the word at the very upper left, the one that says the publisher, those have serifs. Serifs are the little end things that come off of the bottoms of the letters. And so the I has little kind of column toppers, the top and bottom. The S has a little foot at the bottom of the S coming off. The H's are wide there. The word below it, where you see typo, it's a lot bigger. The T has these little extra things that aren't really necessary. And with contemporary typefaces, we usually you see sans serif, which means they just get rid of all that kind of stuff. So the word, I see 2 sans serif typefaces within the examples above. So pause me for a second if you need to and try to find those. One is the word illustrations. You'll see it doesn't have the little notches. And the one that says paper making, printing, engraving, or bookbinding, the one that is italicized, that one is also sans serif. So those ones look a little bit more contemporary than the others, but still not nearly as contemporary as the word typefaces below. So for your homework, you're going to be designing a typeface. And it's going to be important for you to think about where the typeface would be used. So you're going to first envision a use for the typeface, and then you're going to design it so that it is appropriate for that use. So for example, are you designing a typeface to be used on the menu of a cupcake shop? Are you designing a typeface to be used for newspapers? Are you designing a new typeface that is to be used for a wedding announcement, invitation to a wedding? All of these typefaces will look really different from each other. And the decisions that you will make will help the viewers and help your classmates try to guess at what the intention was with that typeface. Okay. If you look at the one that says the word types on the right, that one gives us a sense of money. Kind of looks like the typeface that we see on dollar bills, for example. So that might be useful at, if you're designing like Monopoly money or something. So let's get into a little bit more detail about this homework. Like I said, you'll be designing a typeface. You are going to be inking it on Bristol board. And don't worry, I'll explain what that is in a second. You also want to include an upper and a lowercase version of each of the English letters, the letters in the English alphabet, and you want to spell out a sentence with it as well so we can see what it looks like in action. Okay, let's talk about the items that are in your kit before we get into the homework assignment. So in your kit, you'll find scissors. These are pretty self-explanatory. A eraser. You will find a glue stick. You will find 2 different kinds of pencils, and these might, all of these materials might be different brands from year to year, but you'll basically have the same thing. You're going to have a 6H pencil and a 6B pencil, I believe, in your kit, but this is a 4B pencil. It's very similar. And let me show you the difference between these 2 pencils. The H stands for hard, and the higher the number on a pencil, the more it goes in that direction. So a 2H is not as hard as a 6H, and a 6H is not as hard as an 8H. But you can see you can get very light marks with this, ones that are very easy to erase. So if you ever have to do something like you will in this first assignment, where you first sketch something out, and so you're able to correct it by erasing, but then later when you have a finalized version, you're ready to go back and ink it, you can ink the parts that you want to stay, and once that's dry, just completely erase the H pencil. This is just for kind of planning. Whereas if you ever want the pencil mark to remain and be the ultimate mark that's made, not inking it, you're going to want to use the other pencil, the 6B. B stands for bold. So a 1B is not as bold or as dark, as soft as any higher numbers, just like the H numbers went in the other direction as they got higher. So you can see a really big difference between these two. And if you were to use this pencil when you're drafting, when you're sketching out, and then you inked the final parts with your Sharpie or any other ink pen, and let that dry, and you went back to erase this would be a lot messier. Let me show you the difference. Almost completely gone. This makes a big mess. And you can't completely erase it. And so, unless you know exactly what you want and keeping things permanent, you're going to want to start with the H most of the time. Okay, you also have an X-Acto knife, and in the studio we have lots of cutting boards, cutting mats, so you need something behind. If you're working at home, you can use a cutting board that you just have in your kitchen, or if you don't have one, you could just go to the dollar store, get a cheap plastic cutting board, and that should work just fine too. And you can use this X-Acto knife to cut things out for collages. It's a little hard to do. I'm holding the phone, so let me get a little closer. And it's always important to be slow and precise with this, because if you go fast, you're going to get all kinds of, like I just did there, you're not going to get quite the precision that you need. It's important to hold the paper down flat so it doesn't move around on you when you're cutting out. I'm back. So I was pulling the knife along a straight kind of edge, and whenever I had to turn, instead of just turning the blade, I would lift the blade, turn it a little bit, lift the blade, turn it a little bit more, because if you just go kind of around like this really quickly, it will make the paper, you'll get a fuzzy little white edge around the edge that you don't want. So you can see that happened a little tiny bit along here, and it didn't happen here or along here where I did a slower, more precise job. So when you make a collage, which you'll sometimes do in class or for your homework assignment, you can attach the thing that you cut out, the image that you cut out, either with the glue stick, and I'm not going to demonstrate that because it's pretty obvious. You've been probably doing that your whole life in school, but you could also use Mod Podge. This stuff is a liquid and so it could be applied in a number of ways. I recommend getting a cheap little brush from the dollar store. I think you can see it's pretty goopy. The easiest way to apply it is with a little brush, but you could also use a Q-tip. Some people prefer that. And with that, you would coat the back of your picture and attach it to the surface, of course, just like you would with a glue stick. But the nice thing about Mod Podge is that once you have it attached, you can also use it as a coating on top to keep it from flipping up at the edges. So I applied Mod Podge to the back of this, and I want to get it down and smooth out the paper so there aren't any bubbles. So I'm pushing it out, and it's getting on top, which is fine because it actually is going to help to seal it in anyway. That's the next step, is putting it on top. So right now it's a little bit translucent. You can see the letters from the back of the page through there, but that's just because it's wet. When it dries, it should get nice and white again. So I'm opening my Mod Podge, a little bit on a brush, and when you apply it over top, it looks white at first, but it dries totally clear. And that works as a nice sealant. All right. What have I been working on? I have been working in the sketchbook, which you can use to practice your techniques, like I was just practicing collage there. You can also use it to sketch out concepts. I did that earlier in the sketchbook. Here and here, I was practicing different kinds of typefaces. So the sketchbook is something that you're going to use as a drafting tool. You're going to try things out. You're going to sketch lots of possibilities in there before making a final decision. And your final decisions will be done on Bristol board. It's a finer paper and it's very thick. That's why it's called board and not paper. So you can do your final drafts on this, tear it out, and when you hang it in the classroom, just be sure to put the tacks above it, just slightly above, and just slightly below the thumbtacks when you adhere it to the wall. Oh, my edge is messed up. So that way you don't puncture your final artwork or your final design, all right? Sometimes you might do a photographic piece where you create original photograph and have it printed at the computer lab, or maybe you take it to CVS and get it printed on glossy paper if you prefer. And so you would need to attach that to your Bristol board in order to present it to me and to the class and to turn it in. And so for that, we can use these photo corners that came along with the supplies that we procured for you as well. So you'll need 4 for any kind of rectangle, and the corners of the image fit into these little slots, and the backs of them are stickers. Okay, I slid the photo corners into the corners of this photograph. This isn't something I made for class, it's just a photo of a friend to show you how the corners work. So if I was going to present this on the Bristol board, I would probably, because it's so much smaller, crop the Bristol board to be a more reasonable size for the piece here. But for the sake of just showing you how the corners work, I'm going to be sure to get it nice and even. And if this were for a project, I would actually measure across up and down, make sure that it was equal, and have it perfectly centered. But just for the sake of how to use these, I'm just gonna put it down. Oftentimes people use these photo corners for scrapbooks and things like that too. You can see that he's staying on there pretty well. Okay. Oftentimes in this class, you'll have the option of whether you want to do photography or collage or drawing. And so it's good to know how to use all of these materials. You also received a couple of extra sets of X-Acto knife blades. 2 of the additional ones are exactly like this blade, and that's the type of blade that's going to be most useful in class. But there are a couple of other blades in there, and you can play around with them to see if if you like them. You're welcome to use whatever you want as long as it works for you. Okay. You also received in your kit a Sharpie, and that's pretty self-explanatory. You'll use that to ink your final work sometimes. And you received these Blick Artist color pencils. And it could vary by year, the brand that we use, but you'll always get a pack of colored pencils that are very similar to that. And the nice thing about these is that you could use them the way you would, normally use a pencil to write. That's pretty hard, the way that I'm pushing down, and it gets pretty dark. So I could say, my class. But these can also be used for blending, and so I could use the side of the pencil, get a very light tone, and the more I add to one section, the darker it'll get. So there I already created a kind of a gradient from dark to light, and I can mix that with other colors too. Let's mix that with a bit of pink and get some really detailed blending with this.
It's almost like the way you mix paints together. Just very slowly building it up. And you can also use the side to cover more area more quickly. Okay, so these are really nice for drawing. All right, 3 things that are not in your kit, but which would be very useful, actually 4 if I think about it, are just like a basic cutting board, either a measuring tape or a ruler, and a paintbrush. Now, I didn't include those in the kit because most people have those objects, and I didn't want to add on to the lab fee for the class. But if you don't have one, you could certainly run out to the dollar store and get one of each of these things. Wouldn't have to be this good of a brush, just any cheap brush for putting on the Mod Podge. You can get these things for a few bucks, assuming it's a ruler and not one of these. But we do have lots of professional cutting boards in the studio. We also have rulers in the studio, so you don't actually have to buy them as long as you have access to Francis Ward Hall. And the 4th thing that is not in your kit is either a camera or a phone that can take photographs, and I did not include that in the kit because they're very expensive, and most people have, a phone that can take photographs. You can get your photographs printed in the lab in Francis Ward Hall or any of the computer labs on campus that have color printers, or you could go to CVS or somewhere and have them printed off glossy. It's up to you. It's not going to be any points off for not printing it glossy, not at all. And you can attach photos printed on paper just the same way with those photo corners to your Bristol board for your final turning in of the assignments. If you don't have access to a smartphone with a camera or to a camera, just let me know and we'll find a way for you to be able to take photographs. We'll probably lend you something. If you don't have a pencil sharpener, you don't really need one. It's good to have one, but if you don't have one, you can use your X-Acto knife to sharpen your pencil like so. This will kind of dull the blade, so you have several different X-Acto knife blades in here. Be sure to use the same one to sharpen every time, so that way you don't make the other ones that you use for cutting paper dull. All right, now we're going to move on to designing a typeface. The first thing you want to ask yourself is where and how will the typeface be used, because that will make a big difference. And I'm going to put a still image of this set of questions on the video in a second so you can take a screenshot. So, don't worry about writing it all down now. You can take a screenshot in a moment when I do that. But first, that question, and once you determine that, you can think about which types of shapes would be most appropriate for that function that you've chosen for, where your typeface would end up and what it would do. And then think about whether you want to use serifs or not, which we talked about in the lecture, and then what rules you should create. And we'll get back to the rest of these steps in a moment. All right, I just had the screenshot, those words up for you to screenshot, and now we're back to the design. So the first question I asked was, what is the function of the typeface? Like, what is it going to be used for and how is it going to be used? So I decided I'm going to be advertising, coming up with a typeface to advertise a really fast but elegant sports car. So something between something really fast like a Ferrari and something really elegant like a Jaguar, or Jaguar as they say in the ads. It doesn't have to be something that really exists. So this brand doesn't really exist. There are brands sort of like this, but this is my concept, all right? And so I think the best types of shapes for that, which was the next question, would be ones that are sleek, ones that are diagonal, and ones that are tapered. Now sleek rather than kind of bulbous, because we want it to look like it's moving fast. Same reason for diagonal. Diagonals imply motion, as we described, and we want the car to look fast. Also, the sleek quality would help to increase the sort of elegance of the concept. And I think a tapered top or a tapering at some point would help to create more of a movement. Like we're talking about Nike in the ad, and it's a swoosh. Not only is it diagonal, but it's also tapered, and that makes it look even faster, right? Okay, so now that I have decided those kind of qualities that I'd like to have in my typeface, I have to think about whether or not serifs would do me good. And I think serifs would not help with this because serifs are bulky, so that would go against our sort of fast quality of this design. So now I have to think about what kind of rules I should create. And when I say rules, I mean things like if I decide to make a certain letter diagonal, then I might decide to use that same diagonal throughout all of the letters. And so that would be a rule. All first initial motions on the letters should be diagonal to a certain degree, perhaps. Or I could say, you know, maybe I want all of the crossbars to be straight rather than kind of have a little bit of a wiggle or an angle to them. So the crossbars on the A, crossbars on the H, those types of ideas, instead of here where it's diagonal. And so here in my sketchbook, this is what sketchbooks are for. I would start like this, just kind of coming up with different versions of letters and seeing which ones worked best with my sleek diagonal tapered idea. And so here you'll see that this is my first idea, thick on the left and sort of tapering up, and then the right side being thinner. And here I made the bottom more round, and I also had the opposite side, the skinny side, curve. Here I tried making the letters kind of heavy on the left, like the way that this one's heavy on the left, the lowercase. Didn't like it, and kind of left and bottom. So here I have it just on the bottom, didn't love it. Here I decided to taper it the other way, you know, the opposite. Did not love that. And so here you can see that I'm just sort of working through what looks best in these. And so, and as I try more things, I move on to other ideas. So in this one, it has a little bit of a wiggly crossbar. In this one, the crossbar is diagonal. And in this one, we have a straight introductory kind of shape that does the tapering. And here it's, in this one, it's curved. Here it's curved the other way. And the outside, the other side is, the thin side is tapers out this way, and here it's the opposite. And so I'm just going through and trying things out, putting stars next to the ones I like more. And you have to think about the fact that some letters are wider, like M's and W's, and some letters are circular and like naturally sort of bulbous. And so we'd have to slightly tweak the rules for these compared to these. And so then, you know, you have to work those ideas out too. And I would, for my homework assignment, if I was you, I would do lots more sketches than this. This is just to give you an idea of how I might start. You fill up lots of pages with ideas and try your ideas out and the rules out with lots of different letters. Now let's move back to the page where I had issues to consider listed. Once you've answered the above and designed the typeface, you know, assuming we spent quite a lot of time designing the typeface, just in our sketchbook and making decisions, you must then answer this question: how will I handle the layout of the picture plane? So you want all the letters to fit, and you want them to fit in a neat way, right? Think about this. You've got 26 letters. You need them all upper and lowercase, which means you have 52 letters to design. And you have to have spaces between the letters, spaces between the lines, and 1 or 2 sentences at the bottom. So they're going to have to be pretty small, right, in order to fit. And you want them to be nicely centered or left aligned rather than just kind of wherever they happen to be floating in the middle of the page, because you're designing the letters, but you're also designing the overall page, and you want the whole page to look nice. Think of it as the composition, as we discussed in the lecture. And remember that 2 letters, the M and the W, are extra wide. So that means that you'll need 4 extra wide spaces, because think about the M and the W. It's double N and double U, so you got additional marks to make, right? So let's look at what I started off with in my sketchbook. So I made a couple of mistakes here intentionally to give you an idea of what to do, but I also here set up a lot of things correctly. So you will need, when you're designing these, to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 divisions for each line of typeface. And the reason is that some letters go from the base all the way to the top. Some of them droop below the baseline. Some of them do not. And so we need to also have these little divisions between in case you want your letters not to go as high. For instance, like I did here, I'm deciding to keep my crossbars close to the nearest important section, you know, bottom, top, or middle. And so here you can see my F. I have the crossbar close to the top, this one close to the bottom. You could decide to put them right in the middle, and you could decide to have this perhaps go all the way down and then come up to here. You know, you might need this extra line information to know where things would stop. Now, I didn't do that in this one, so I probably wouldn't need this crossbar, but as I'm having all mine sort of not loop too much because I want to have that fast feeling, you know, not like it's curving around and slowing down. Okay, you also want to have a space in between, as I mentioned, your lines of typeface in the design on the paper, because otherwise you would see that the bottom of the G would be touching the top of the L, and we certainly don't want that, do we? No. And so it's important to also have a space here, 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 and then, you know, it would just continue on. I chose these letters, this part of the alphabet to do because it has an M in it, and it also has some that droop down below. And so think about the fact that you might have an entire line where none droop down below, and you might not have to have quite as many spaces in that line. All right, so let's talk about some of the rules I created here. First, I decided that I would have only thickness on one section of the letters, and it would generally be on the left, unless it's something like a G where there isn't really a long section on the left. So see the same angle everywhere. So that checks out, it makes it look cohesive. I also decided that any crossbars or things that go off of that one that's thick at the bottom and tapers at the top would be kind of short and straight. And so it's the second rule that I created, and it's followed, it's followed, it's followed, except for here. So here's one where I intentionally broke away from the rule to show you what would happen if one of them doesn't have a rule. So when I stand back and look at these as a whole, this one doesn't seem to fit the capital I, does it? It doesn't look like it goes with the others. And another problem is it really looks like a Z, and so it's not gonna work. And so if you go in here and find that you've kind of messed up a rule, this is fine because we're doing this all in very light pencil. So it's very easy to fix. We want this to be still angled, and still tapered, but we want the top and the bottom to be straight. And now it looks more like it's piers, right? So this curve would probably just go straight into here, because otherwise it would look like two different shapes just touching each other. We want it to look like one. All right, so there's an example. I also decided as a rule that anytime I had a dot, like with the J's and the I's, I would have the dot be slightly to the left of the overall main body structure of the letter, because, of course, I want it to look like it's really fast, right? We want it to look like it's zooming by, and so it's going so fast that it's leaving the dot behind, sort of like in a cartoon. Now you can see that I also made a mistake with the lowercase I because I have it curving and all of the others are straight, right? And so it doesn't look cohesive either, and it looks a little bit like a J because of course my J curves because it, you know, J's curve. And so I have to go back and correct that. And it's quite easy to do with the H pencil. Let's make sure it's still at the same angle as the others. It is, so we're good there. So now the eyes are fitting into the rules, okay? And I wanted my letters to be centered, and so I screwed that up a little bit so I could show you what would happen if I didn't measure it properly. And this is why it's important to have a ruler or a measuring tape. So I decided I wanted to give myself a certain amount of space for each capital letter and for each lowercase letter. You know, it would be a smaller amount of space because they're smaller letters. And I also gave myself a little bit extra space where the M is. And I missed the lowercase m, so I made a lot of mistakes here. Another place where I messed up this is that I have a very small area that is not utilized in this in my attempt to center it on the page. And here I have a much larger one. And here I have equal ones. So this one was pretty good, except that this is missing because I forgot to do the lowercase m. And so it's really important to do this on the whole design of the page too, in your sketchbook before you actually do it on the Bristol board, your final. And that's why you have a couple of weeks on this assignment in this class. It's a lot to design. You have to design each letter, you have to design the layout of the page, and you have to, do it first here and then translate it over onto your Bristol board and then ink it. So it's quite a bit of work. So you'll notice that I also don't have the edges go right to the edges of the page because we wouldn't let any letters, touching the edge of the ground. It wouldn't look neat. It would look unintentional. And so for this example, I use the dark pencil to show the main parts of the kind of placements on here, the very bottom, the baseline, halfway between the base and the top, But when you're doing this in your sketchbook and in your final, you're certainly going to want to do this with your 6H pencil, the one that's a lot lighter and easier to erase, because ultimately, once you have the whole thing, the whole alphabet plus your 2 sentences, or 1 to 2 sentences, on the final Bristol board, which is one nice thing is that they're exactly the same size, the sketchbook and the Bristol board. So however you design it here, you'll be able to completely replicate it in the final. So once you have this all kind of worked out, you can go back in with your Sharpie, or if you have a smaller black pen, you could use that too. I like the Sharpie because it has a really fine point, but you can also kind of turn it to the side and get a thicker point more quickly, a thicker line more quickly. So ultimately you will be in your Bristol board inking it once you have it totally perfect. And once that dries, and I would definitely give it a couple of minutes, it might seem dry, but sometimes you can get a blur if you try it a little bit too fast. Once you have it completely done, you're going to be going back and erasing the whole grid and erasing any kind of places where you changed your mind and altered where things go. And so the final piece on your Bristol board would be arranged somewhat like this. You would have the lines of the alphabet at the top, and you wouldn't necessarily have the same amount of letters per line. And then at the bottom, you will have your sentence or 2 spelled out with this typeface, okay? All right. So when I was trying to determine how to center these and making spaces on either sides, I was using, math to try to figure out how much space I would need, because I was designating a certain width to capital letters and a different width to lowercase letters. So you can see the capitals are all the same and the lowercases are all the same, except down here, K, K, L, L, M. I gave the M extra space because I was anticipating that I would need extra space for the M because it has so much of a width to it compared to other, letters like the L. And I realized once I started doing the N that the way that I had set up my rules makes the N just as wide as the M, because I have my secondary, things that would be vertical normally but are horizontal in my typeface, but I have the secondary ones very straight up and down. And so the N doesn't take up any more room than the M does because it would just come straight down off of it. And so I didn't leave myself enough space to make the N. I also realized I didn't need nearly as much space for the I. the lowercase I takes up almost no space at all. And so when I think about how many letters to have on each line, when you're doing your trial here in the sketchbook, it's good to just anticipate that certain letters will need more than others. But then when you actually go in and try to put them in this rough draft version in the sketchbook, you'll find things like that. And then you'll be able to keep that in mind for when you go over to the Bristol board. Remember, you'll just remember I can be a little bit shorter. So you have to factor that into your math too, about how much space to leave on either side. Okay, so once you have the very final version of your alphabet, upper, lowercase, and your two sentences in your Bristol board inked, then you're going to go back and erase the pencil marks that you have used to create the grid. So I'll do that now here around the F. Now, as I mentioned, I use the bolder pencil to distinguish between some of the lines, just so that we could see which lines were meant to be which here. But of course, in the final, in your version of the rough draft even, you'll be using only the H pencil the whole time. And so it will erase a lot more nicely than this. And you can also see that even with the H, I sort of embossed the paper a little bit. I pushed too hard. And so there's an indentation in the paper. So it's very important to keep your hand really light. You know, there's a difference between using an H pencil like this and using an H pencil like this. Both erased, but there's that indentation that will never go away now. Okay, so if you have any questions, please do send me an email or put them on Celtic Online or ask when we're together in class on Wednesday. So I had a student years ago who decided she wanted to make a butterfly kind of typeface for some kind of garden party with butterflies, something like that. And so the typeface I remember looked something like this. She had, she wanted all the parts of the letters to sort of look like wings. So this would have been her B, and she had a thickness at the edges kind of facing this way, and it was thin at the other edges, and it had a butterfly wing off of it, off of every single one. And so the problem with something like this is that each individual letter was certainly lovely, but they were very hard to read. They were almost illegible. And so when she spelled out her sentences, the class was looking at them like trying to figure out what it said. So it's always important to stay fairly simple with your typefaces, so that way it is legible. Now, if you want to do something a little bit fancier with your capital letters, but leave your lowercase letters blank, you might be able to get away with it, assuming it's not too fancy, so that way, you know, everybody can be sure to read it.